Senator Coulthard, thank you for a magnificent lecture, and thank you for your consistent witness to justice, goodness, and as well, Jesus Christ himself. I agree with what you have to say, but my question is, why ought contemporary Western states agree with you when so often they themselves seem to be abdicating the right to make any comments about such absolute values as goodness? When we consider that the internal logic of many states seems to run more on a mishmash of relativism and hedonism that certainly runs through the intellectual elite, and that states themselves seem to be little more than providers of goods and services, almost like the telephone company, as Alistair McIntyre would say. I was wondering if you'd like to comment on that.
Well, absolutely. And I think it comes down to one phrase, and that is self-interest. Our obligation is to challenge Western nations that it is in their own self-interest to reduce military spending and to address the causes of terrorism, the root causes of terrorism. It is only when we address that self-interest and show Western nations that we will, let's take, for example, Al-Qaeda terrorism, and even the events in Norway in the last week, that it is virtually impossible to use military means to prevent extremists the world over from setting off bombs. That the way to reduce the incidence of that is to remove the anger that bubbles in individual people, which is exploited by evil elderly men, and I stress elderly men throughout the world, and then used to inflate terrorist organizations the world over. I'm not naive. I understand that if you just try to say that it's a good thing for the United States to reduce military spending because it'll be a good thing to have better schools in Africa, that simply won't work. One has to persuade those countries that are primarily engaged in these practices that ultimately they are going to be more secure and they will have more trade opportunities if they redirect, for example, their resources.
Andrew Cameron, Anglican Diocese of Sydney. Thank you so much, Senator Coulthard, for your heartfelt oration. One of the things that I found so refreshing about it was the easy seamlessness between your attention to peace and justice and your trust in Jesus Christ and his teachings. We have a kind of a national blood sport here in Australia where if someone speaks of an issue and then breathes the word that they have a faith of any sort, our cry goes up, attention swings to their faith away from the issue, partly as maybe a kind of paranoia about theocracy and partly as a kind of theatrical way of drawing attention away from a political issue, a political position that the opponent wants to sort of take attention away from. So I'm wondering, firstly, do you have that kind of experience in your context? Presumably there's people that don't agree with your faith position. And secondly, what advice you would have for people in our context who continually have that experience? Thanks.
I think one of the dangers of living in the West and in living in a well-run and efficient country such as Australia is that there are many props in life that obscure our relationship with God. When the book of James says that we are to rejoice in our suffering because it refines us, that's hard to apply in a Western context. The reason I can speak out forcefully is that in a bizarre way, I've been privileged to live in the chaos of Zimbabwe. Because through that chaos, the security of a pension, the security of any social welfare, the security of knowing that the police will only arrest criminals, it's all been stripped away. And I personally and my family have had to trust in God. There's been no one else to trust in. And we found him faithful. We found him faithful in the last 30 years since returning to Zimbabwe. We found him faithful through a genocide, through numerous attempts to arrest, through death threats, through one assassination attempt. And that builds our confidence in him. The tragedy in the West is that you have so many other props most people in the West never get that opportunity unless they're placed in an enormous, a huge personal trial to actually experience the faithfulness and the consistency of God in their lives. But once you've experienced it, it emboldens one.
Senator, I'd like to ask you a question about your own country. During the 40s and 50s and 60s, the church groups took a leading role in leading the opposition towards the Rhodesian authorities. And there are a number of missionary organizations that I'm thinking of that involved a number of young Africans who worked on these mission stations. I'm thinking of things like Guy Cluttenbrock's Cold Comfort Farm. And these young Africans became very devout Christians, very dedicated to the cause of God. After 1980, a number of these individuals, and I shan't name them, but a number of them actually became very prominent forces and absolute, well, they changed their position quite dramatically. I wondered how this fits into your model of goodness and...
Well, that's why I was at pains to suggest right at the beginning that I don't view the church as the physical institution. I view the church rather as the collective of people who have placed their trust and faith in Christ. I think the tragedy in any country, it's not confined to Zimbabwe, is that there's a lot of nominalism, that there's a lot of superficial religion. When I said at the beginning that I'm not religious, I meant that I'm not religious in the sense that I, for example, believe that if you don't go to church on Sunday, you're going to be condemned forever. My faith is much deeper than that. It is found in a deep, abiding trust in a sovereign God. And I think the tragedy is, in the Zimbabwean context, that there may have been many people who were swept up by the institutionalized church, but who never came to a personal trust in a God who stands for justice and goodness. And often that situation was compounded by the fact that the churches were the avenue to an education. And the churches, the institutionalized church, made it a condition that you would become an adherent of that particular denomination if you were to get an education, rather than focusing on where the individual was at in his relationship with God. And that has resulted in many people, and this doesn't apply to Zimbabwe, it applies the world over, who are nominally Christians, but in fact, whose lives don't bear any resemblance to Christ.
I can see the point in your model, and I speak as a Christian, in relation to dealing with anger. You talked in a previous answer about the anger of the young person exploited by the older man. But does the model deal with an opposing fundamentalism, so that people that want to extend the caliphate, for instance, or extend the Christian theocracy, someone who it's a clash of ideas worldview, are you going to get peace against those sort of people?
No, and I think that's why that verse of the kingdom of God is forcefully advancing, but forceful men will lay hold of it. And it goes on to say that is going to be an ongoing phenomenon. And I was at pains to stress that it doesn't matter what we do, either in terms of military spending or even if what I say is listened to, and there's a reduction. There will always be forceful men. There will always be extremists in every society, as we've seen in Norway this past week. One of the most peaceful countries in the world has generated an extremist who's done such vile things. And nothing we can do can prevent people like that from doing those wicked acts. My argument is simply that if the West thinks that simply by building up military superiority, it can stop terrorism, then I believe it's misguided. There needs to be a balance. One has to have the deterrent of military power, as I stressed, but there needs to be an almost equal focus on removing the source of anger as best as one can. One will never remove poverty throughout the world, but doing a lot more to address poverty. And in doing so, we will lessen, I believe, the number of people who are sucked into terrorist organizations.
Senator Coulthard, thank you for just a wonderful meshing of faith and practicality. And many of us work in development, and many of us can see the connection between development and security, that there's a real connection between sustainable development in disadvantaged communities. And we can see that this is absolutely real. What you've said is absolutely real. That if we can get enough development going, that automatically brings security level by level by level. How do we convince governments who are not remotely thinking like this? They don't see it as a practical thing at all. And not only security for the people who you are trying to bring development to, but that spills over to regional security, and then that comes up and up to so that it's actually good for the providers of the help that it brings. It actually, I believe, can move up to international security.
I think that the best way is to do a comparative analysis of nations where development assistance has been done efficiently and where development assistance has perhaps been done inefficiently or not at all. And I think what one can show, I don't have any empirical studies to back up what I'm saying, but if I think in an African context, a country like Botswana, which has spent its development assistance, such as it has received, efficiently, is a far more stable country and peaceful country than a country like Angola, where the West is looking the other way, where oil revenues are being exploited, which is developing a ruling elite, a super wealthy ruling elite. But I believe that in future there's going to be far more instability that will come out of Angola than will ever come out of Botswana. And it's through that comparative analysis. And I just want to stress one point. I'm skeptical about development assistance because of what I've seen in Zimbabwe. I think it's better not to spend any money at all than to spend on corrupt governments and to build white elephants. And there needs to be that equal emphasis. We need to support the private sector. We need to support institutions that are going to foster democracy. And of course, we've got to focus resources on social welfare matters such as education and health.
Thank you, Senator, for a terrific address. My question follows your comments there. How do governments in the West direct aid to non-government agencies and private bodies in developing countries without running into significant political difficulty? And how do private individuals in the West or groups in the West identify such responsible people in developing countries in order to direct aid to them?
I can't tell you how delighted I am with your question, sir, because you've given me the perfect lead-in. I've had to confront this issue as Minister of Education. There is still enormous skepticism in the West regarding this fragile transitional process that we've chosen. There's an understanding that Robert Mugabe is still president and that all the coercive ministries are still controlled by ZANU-PF, and that we cannot guarantee in any way that this process is going to end well. And because of that, there's been an enormous reluctance in the West to put any assistance in. And as Minister of Education, when I took office 2 years ago, I came to a situation where 8,000 schools were closed, 90,000 teachers on strike, the public examinations written the previous November hadn't even been marked, the textbook pupil ratios were one textbook for 15 kids, just absolute chaos in the system. And I was also faced with the reality that there was no money in government coffers. The Zimbabwe dollar collapsed. All of us, when we took office, right across the civil servants, were being paid $100 a month. That gives you some, as minister, that was my first salary, $100 a month. I use that to illustrate that there was no money, there was insufficient money in government coffers to pay for education. And so I had to try and devise a scheme to address the skepticism of the international community. And we did so by setting up the Education Transition Fund in conjunction with UNICEF. And the way it's structured, I chair the fund, UNICEF manages it, so I don't sign or get my grubby fingers on a cent. And we work by consensus with the donor communities. Every donor country which wants to contribute to education in Zimbabwe becomes a member of the Education Transition Fund. And it's worked very well. We've got, for example, textbook pupil ratios down to 1-to-1 in just over a year in primary education. We're now moving on to secondary education. And UNICEF are saying that it's one of the best models they have throughout the world. So that's how governments can be persuaded, and we're now in Zimbabwe using that model for other ministries. And for those who are skeptical about development assistance, we've ensured that all of the money has been spent efficiently, and virtually all of it has gone to private institutions, to publishing houses, to printing houses, to transport companies, to print textbooks and deliver them. How can individuals help? Well, I think once again, to put this plug in, through that organization, it's being run by UNICEF. Individuals can contribute to UNICEF. I'm not sure whether you get any tax advantage in Australia, but I think you certainly can in America. And I think it's through models like that that governments can ensure that their money is going to be spent properly, and the same model can be used by individuals. Thank you.